Hey, I'm Brent. This is my language journal. Welcome back. This is going to be for the months of June and July for 2021. I've traditionally said that this is going to be monthly, but I don't think it's ever actually been monthly. And that's not necessarily for a lack of commitment per se, but I want each of these videos to really have something unique to them. And I felt like June was a bit of a tough month, and there was no eureka moment to really fuel what I wanted to put out. I feel like with each video that I've put out thus far, there's been some, I don't know, grand revelation, at least to me, like subjectively. And I just haven't had that through June nor July. Like I have some new ideas that I want to talk about and share, but this is really more about, it's about me wanting to put out a journal, because that's what this is really, to the people who have been following, because there's a couple hundred people now. I have an air in my eye. Because there's a couple hundred people now who have been following consistently, and thank you for that, like genuinely. Thank you for listening to me ramble. But I think for that reason, or rather, as indicated by the fact that there's a couple hundred people watching, that there's something salient about me sharing my personal experience that really seems to maybe connect with people. And my hope is with this, I don't know, episode, journal entry, to really get probably more vulnerable than I have before, because this has been a point where I've lacked more motivation than I ever have before. And I've sort of broken through that a bit, but I'm definitely still struggling. So let's get to the beginning of June. So this was a point where I was supposed to be chorusing / shadowing frequently. I was supposed to be doing some written entries, some written practice, but I didn't really end up doing any of this. And in fact, my immersion hours went down from probably like the 10 I was averaging the 10 or 9 to maybe like 5 or 6 some days. And you guys might be wondering why is that, what changed? And the way I would describe it is we have these two skills, right? Two general categories. You have input, and then you have output, and then you have the sub skills within them. So input, you have reading and listening, and for output, it's writing and speaking. And one thing that I noticed over time, and this is still an issue I have, but I've grown to just accept that it's a function, or it's an expected outcome of the threefold method. There's an increasing discrepancy that grows between your ability to interpret input and your ability to produce output. So at the beginning, these two skills are roughly equal, right? It's like you have your input ability, which is 0, your output ability, which is also 0. And then you find refold methods. You do RTH or whatever you do, some sort of spaced repetition system that gradually exposes you to the characters and such. You begin to be able to interpret the language. Maybe you then start watching dramas or something of the such. And gradually over time, you find yourself beginning to understand what's happening. There's interactions between people, and you can understand what's happening there. But were you to be one of those people in the interaction, despite you maybe being able to understand what's being said to you, you wouldn't be able to produce something, or at least that wasn't my experience. And then over time, as you gain more and more experience with input, this discrepancy, as I'm calling it, grows between input and output. And you can imagine this is frustrating. Like, I'm now at a point, and this was the case in June, that I could read books with a pop-up dictionary. I can watch the majority of shows with subtitles without a ton of effort. Maybe at like a level 5 comprehension, as long as the topic isn't too niche. And yet my ability to output was that of I don't even know how to describe it, because like my vocabulary is relatively, like my expressive vocabulary is relatively developed. It's just I wasn't able to actually communicate with that. I could have basic spoken conversations, like painful spoken conversations where I was making a ton of grammatical mistakes, where as they were coming out of my mouth, I knew they were wrong. In written conversations, I was a bit better because it was slower, and there's time for you to correct your own mistakes before you actually hit the send button. But this is something that really it grew to discourage me. I'd put all of this effort into Chinese, and I could, for all intents and purposes, understand the language at maybe at least a basic level. And yet I arrived at a point where I sat down one night after a frustrating experience, and I sort of diaried, I journaled, and I decided that I was going to, in the same spirit of this YouTube channel, I was going to make that public because maybe people would find that useful. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read that journal entry to you. So we'll swap you over, just make sure you can see. Yep. So this is what I wrote here. And you can either read it and pause, or I'm going to narrate it right now. So this is going to be a Dear Diary sort of post. In large part, I'm writing this for myself. However, I figure that, like with much of my journey, the issues that I encounter are unlikely to be ones that I exclusively experience, and so I've decided to share this. I'm at a point of extreme frustration with my Chinese learning. Truly, nothing in my journey has yet to have bothered me to this degree. The issue is with my output, or lack thereof. I've been intensively learning Chinese with immersion-based methods since April of last year. In this time, I've experienced what I would describe as immensely disappointing, yet simultaneously impressive progress. What do I mean by this? Well, learning a language has not felt how I imagined it might. There's no switch that ever flips. There's never a point where you understand the language. Instead, you wake up each day and have moved forward an amount below the threshold of the just noticeable difference. You progress, yet you never feel like you are progressing. I understand Chinese. Now, I wouldn't say that I understand Chinese at a high level, but I can read literature in the news with a bit of pop-up dictionary assistance. I can understand shows well with subtitles and functionally follow them without subtitles, and I possess a reasonably developed understanding of Chinese culture. Despite all of this, however, I have nothing to really show for it. There is a stupidly large disconnect between my ability to interpret output and generate, or to interpret input and generate output. I'm not sure if I can provide a description of the negative emotions that would do them justice. The more that my comprehension abilities develop, the more frustrated that I become with my output abilities. Or the more that my yeah. It feels as if these things ought to be tightly tethered, yet they are clearly not. Rosan and I spoke about this in a recent recorded conversation, will eventually be released, and when it is released, I'll put it in the description here. But I think that I've developed a quasi-phobia of output. Every piece of the language that I generate functions as a reminder of that painful disconnect that currently exists between input and output, resulting from the past year and a half of hard work. One thing that I've learned in life, though, is that complaining is useless. I'm uncomfortable with the prospect of confronting my inadequacies because, in truth, they are entirely self-created. I'm in this position due to my own inactions. This precisely is where the words of caution come in. Beware of developing output phobia in strict adherence to threefold guidelines. I won't go into this point too much here, but I will in this video, though I undoubtedly will in the future. But seriously, please do yourself a favor and think deeply about what I'm saying. The big question, what am I going to do about my predicament? Well, the only solution in my mind is one of relaxing my ego and forcing myself into low pressure situations where I have no choice but to output. Starting next week, I will be scheduling thrice weekly italki tutoring sessions on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The tutoring sessions will be less so tutoring sessions and more so conversations. I will be instructing the teacher, or teachers, but it was a teacher, I found one I like, to under no circumstances speak English. While there are more details related to this, I think that I've made the gist clear. Yada yada yada. So anyways, that's where I was. It was not a good position to be in emotionally, and you can probably read that in like the underlying emotions in the text. There was this discrepancy between input and output. Every time I outputted, it was a reminder of this discrepancy, this position that I've put myself in. And I didn't know how to solve it. Because like I said, I developed something of a quasi-phobia of output. And I think this is something that people who follow refold methods are likely more prone to. Because and this is no fault of Ethan or Matt. I've said in the past that I think their method is the best on the internet, or the best I've been exposed to. But in telling people that they should avoid outputting until they've developed maybe level 5 or 6 comprehension in a domain, what you're really doing is you're creating a negative relationship with output. You're teaching people that when they output, and you're not directly doing this, but when you tell people that when they output, they shouldn't be doing that, they will naturally output a bit at the beginning because it's exciting, but then they're gonna have some sort of check or gate in their head that anytime output begins to approach that gate, it'll be pushed back in the future. And I think I've developed this, and I'm currently still trying to tear it down. So I mentioned italki tutors in that post there. And what I've done, and I've thought about this a lot, is I found one tutor that I trust. Because especially at the beginning, you put yourself in a vulnerable position. And there's also the issue of you wanting to default back into your own language. So what I've done is I found a person that I one, trust, and two, a person that is only going to speak Chinese to me, so that I can't scurry away because of that phobia and move into English. Like, they will only speak Chinese to me if I don't understand something. They will then describe it in Chinese and sort of move around the point. I speak a bit of English, sorry, and I speak a bit of English to them, and they understand English, but I try and limit that. It's really only if I can't express a point. But even then, I try and ask how I would say that in Chinese while using Chinese. And this has been helpful. I don't think I'm yet at a point where this quasi-phobia has disappeared. And maybe it's worth saying that this phobia, as I'm calling it, isn't social in nature. Like, I'm not a person who really has any issues speaking with people, typically, in English. Yet when it comes to Chinese, I think it's more of an ego. It's not that I'm worried what the other person is going to think, because I don't think them looking at me, they have very high expectations of what my Chinese is going to be anyways. It's more that I have these high expectations of myself as a function of my ego that I'm currently trying to tear down. And I found italki to be relatively helpful with that. But at the same time, I don't know, were I giving advice to somebody else when I would actually advise a person to start. Because maybe I'm actually at the point, and I probably am, where the refold method would recommend that I begin to do something like this. Because I am able to listen to a person speak Chinese to me and miss certain points, but be able to, generally speaking, get their message, even in relatively complex contexts, as long as the vocabulary isn't outside of the purview or my purview. Now, that's been a big issue, and I'm happy to report that it's something that I'm working on and I'm making progress on. But there's something else that we're sort of changing topics now that's been bothering me. And this is my over-reliance on the written form of the Chinese language as opposed to the spoken form. And Matt has actually talked about this before. And he said it's an issue that, for him, has been difficult to solve. If you develop an over-reliance on the written language at the beginning, it's a problem that sort of persists and sticks with you. And I've thought about this, and I've talked to some people about this whose opinions I respect. And basically what we've concluded, or what I've sort of concluded in speaking to them, is the spoken form of the language is like a lower order form of the language. Now, I don't really have a sophisticated background in programming, but from what I understand, there are programming languages that get more fundamental as you go down. Like I think C focus, like optimization happens there, but then there's higher order languages like maybe Python or something. And I hope I'm not butchering this because I know there's a lot of much more tech savvy people in the community. But I sort of think of it like that. There's the spoken language, which is the core true form of the language. There are the phonemes and the morphemes attached to this and they're spoken out words, and you listen to them. And then there's the written form of the language, which it takes that information and it tries to condense it into a form that you can write. There's the characters, or perhaps unique to Chinese, and you wouldn't find this with a lot of European languages. There's the characters, and then there's the either pinyin or zhuyin, depending what system you use. If you're focused more on in Taiwan or the mainland. But I focused on pinyin, and one thing I found learning how to articulate Chinese and understand it through pinyin, and like I can obviously read characters, but I sort of think of characters in relation to pinyin. Like that is more, in my mind, fundamental, because I guess that's how my brain processes sound or written language. You have an alphabet, and that's core to the language. Like, sounds are made up of alphabetized words, and then there's a tone on top. But interestingly, and I said this while talking with a friend, is I tend to think of the tone as being a secondary part of the sound, which it very clearly isn't, and he pointed that out well to me. So pinyin, so say you have xiang, so Xiang, and then you put a first tone above that. I think of xiang as being the sound, and then the tone is being a modifier on that, whereas a native speaker wouldn't think of it that way. And I wonder if a person focused more on the listening aspect of the language at the beginning, if they wouldn't have developed that perhaps maladaptive interpretation of the sound system. So I don't really know actually what to advise about this. Maybe don't do that. Don't focus as much on reading at the beginning. But I think it's sort of a tough relationship, and I don't want to ramble on and dive too deep into this. But it's definitely something to think about if you're earlier on. Like, get yourself more exposure to the sound system early on without relying on interpreting that sound system through a higher order form of the language. Because you really do lose nuance at that point. It's like lower order, higher order. Whereas if you then take higher order as the default in interpreting the lower order, instead of learning the lower order and then interpreting the higher order, I think you lose more nuance going down like this versus going up. And I hope I explained that well. Maybe not, though. Anyways, one thing I'll probably... There's two more things I want to talk about. One is my experience with Chinese thus far. And like I had my girlfriend who was a Chinese speaker throughout this entire process. But the thing is, she spoke English basically fluently. All of her interactions were in English. And she's been in Canada for long enough that she now thinks in English and she processes information as a Canadian would. And Chinese speakers even would tell her that the things she says sound like she's a Lawai, etc. So while I had exposure, really Chinese was an abstract concept for most of me learning it. I would sit in this room that is not the one you see on the green screen, unfortunately. And I would stare at this screen for many, many hours a day during the pandemic. And I would use Anki. I would watch a lot of dramas, movies. But it's very abstract, right? It's like, I'm here. There are people on my screen. They're learning, or they're speaking the language. I'm learning the language. I understand them. But it's not as real to me. And now that I've begun outputting, and I think this is going to be sort of the transition in motivation. As I said, I was lacking motivation before. I think once I'm able to output at a reasonable level, I'll sort of regain that deep motivation, or I hope I will. But one thing I've noticed is that I sort of understood this theoretically at the beginning, that languages are a mode of being and not just a way of communicating, if that makes sense. And I think I've explained this in previous videos. But it isn't until you actually look into the eyes of a person who uses that language as a way of being and as a way of processing information that you realize that, hey, wait, this is perhaps a bit strange. Like, I've lived my entire life monolingually, and now suddenly I can look into the eyes of another person as they're expressing completely abstract thoughts, or completely abstract in the sense of a Westerner wouldn't say these, and they're speaking these to me in Chinese, and then I can reply in Chinese, and it's been strange, but I get how those, like, the polyglot types get hooked on language learning, like, genuinely. It's a very powerful, salient, emotionally rich feeling. But that's kind of what I have to say on that. My view of Chinese has changed from being more abstract on one side to flipping around and being more of a mode of being. And I've pushed for that all along, with eating with chopsticks and transitioning my life towards being that of more how a Chinese person would live. But again, it was all theoretical, and now it's really starting to kick in more. And none of these are my ideas necessarily. While I haven't read a lot of the AgeOut website, I've read enough that I think this is like the essence of what AgeOut was going for. You need to adopt a new mode of being versus having language as an abstract tool or concept that you use to communicate. So it's something to consider if you're having a difficult time connecting with the culture of the language that you're learning. All right, final topic. I made some comments in the last video that a couple people have challenged me on, and rightfully so. And if I ever say anything that seems incorrect, please do come on the Discord and push the point. forward and challenge me. I love being challenged, and I feel like the reason my views and beliefs evolve every couple months so dramatically is because I'm constantly trying to challenge my notion of what language is, what language learning means. But because I've been challenged on this point, this idea of active study or active grammar studying being a necessity to reach a high level in the language, I've now sort of maybe matured my thinking on the topic. And let me pull this up. I wrote this earlier. And I'm not necessarily going to read this, but if you would like to pause the video and look at this, you can. I wrote this up earlier, but I'm going to perhaps more succinctly now summarize what I said. So basically, I now think that active grammar study is much more necessary for written output than it is spoken output. I think that it is completely possible to adopt a spoken form of the language without any exposure to the written form, provided you have enough social exposure. It's like the person who challenged me brought up AAVE, which is, I believe, African American Vernacular English, and how a lot of the Black community in America speaks this as a dialect of English, and obviously they can still speak standard English, but they can swap back and forth. And yet they're never really formally taught this, and I think that's actually a good point. In my mind, this sort of it matches what I was saying, but I don't think I explained earlier on how it does match. And it's really just this idea that if you have enough social exposure, you can pick up the spoken form of the language, but with the written form, there's a lot more nuance and it's a lot less natural. And I think I explained this before. This idea that written language is an artifact, where spoken language is much more like primordial. It's much deeper in us, and it's hardwired and processed in very different ways. And so I think the way in which you learn to adopt the patterns of spoken language is very different than that of written language. And the patterns in written language they're technically the same thing, but because they're processed differently, I think you need a more concerted focus on learning them. And maybe I'm going to change my opinions on this eventually, but that's currently where I sit. So to succinctly put it, I think that active study is much more necessary for written output than it is spoken output. And that's where I sit currently. But yeah, this video was a lot less structured than before. And there was no real eureka moment, as I think I said earlier, that brought me here. This was more about me wanting to show up for the 300 odd people who have been following my journey, which again, thank you guys for. But I think the video is done now. So take care. See you in probably not a month, unless something big happens, but maybe 2. And it's probably worth stating that no matter where my output is, for the next video, I am committing on camera, it's documented at this point, that I will demonstrate my output abilities to you at that time in a free flow format, completely unscripted. So hope you guys look forward to that. Take care and go immerse.